October 17th, 1945. Ueno Station, Tokyo. The autumn rain fell steadily on what remained of the city, mixing with the ash that still drifted from burned-out buildings, creating a gray paste that covered everything. 32-year-old Michiko Nakamura stood on the crowded platform, holding a photograph that had survived the firebombing of her neighborhood 6 months earlier. The edges were charred, the image water-stained, but you could still see 3 faces: herself, her husband Hiroshi, and their daughter Yuki, age 7, taken in the spring of 1944, before the world ended. She had been holding that photograph for 4 hours, showing it to every woman who passed, asking the same question in a voice hoarse from repetition. "Have you seen this child? Have you seen my daughter?" Most women shook their heads and moved on, absorbed in their own desperate searches. Tokyo in October 1945 was a city of ghosts hunting ghosts. Mothers searching for children, children searching for parents, everyone looking for fragments of families that the war had scattered like leaves in a typhoon. Then an American soldier approached. Tall, young, impossibly clean in his pressed uniform. Michiko's first instinct was fear. She had been taught that American soldiers were beasts, that they would assault Japanese women, that she should flee or hide. But she was too tired for fear, too broken, too desperate. The soldier, through a Japanese translator who followed him, asked, "Are you looking for someone?" Michiko held up the photograph with shaking hands. She didn't expect help. She expected mockery or indifference, or perhaps some cruel reminder that this was what defeat meant. What she didn't expect was for the American soldier to take the photograph gently, study it carefully, and say through the translator, "Come with me. We've set up a family registry office. We might be able to help you find her." Michiko Nakamura followed that American soldier through the ruins of Tokyo to a converted school building where other Americans, working alongside Japanese civilians, were compiling lists of survivors, creating registries of displaced persons, building a system to reconnect families that war had torn apart. And in that moment, something inside her broke open, not with despair, but with the first fragile possibility of hope. This is the story of how American compassion accomplished what military victory could not. How soldiers who had fought against Japan became the architects of its healing. How the simple act of helping mothers find their children destroyed decades of propaganda and planted the seeds of reconciliation between nations that had tried to annihilate each other. And how thousands of Japanese women discovered that their most dangerous enemy had become their most unlikely savior. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is kindness from those you've been taught to hate. To understand what it meant for Americans to help Japanese families reunite, you must first understand the magnitude of the separation. Japan in the autumn of 1945 was a nation of the lost. Not just defeated, but fractured, scattered, its social fabric torn beyond recognition. The numbers tell one story: 66 Japanese cities bombed, 2.3 million homes destroyed, 8.5 million people displaced from their homes, 300,000 children separated from their families. But numbers cannot capture the psychological devastation of a society where every certainty had been shattered, where the very structure of family, the foundation of Japanese culture, had been blown apart.
Michiko Nakamura's story was tragically common. On the night of March 9, 1945, American B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo in what would become the deadliest air raid in human history. The firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left over 1 million people homeless. Michiko had been working a night shift at a factory that produced aircraft parts, part of the total mobilization of Japanese civilians for war production. Her husband, Hiroshi, was serving with the army in Manchuria. Their daughter, Yuki, age 7, was supposed to be safe with Michiko's mother in their neighborhood of Asakusa. That night, the neighborhood ceased to exist. When Michiko returned from her shift the next morning, she found nothing. Not ruins. Ruins would have been something. She found empty space where her street had been. Ash still smoking. Heat so intense she couldn't get close enough to search for bodies. The fire had been so hot that it had consumed everything, leaving no trace of the thousands who had died there. For 3 days, Michiko searched through the devastation, looking for any sign of her mother or daughter. She checked makeshift morgues where bodies, burned beyond recognition, were laid out in rows. She walked through survivor camps, showing the photograph to everyone she met, asking her desperate question over and over. Have you seen this child? No one had. In the chaos of that night, as the firestorm consumed Asakusa, thousands of children had been separated from their families. Some had fled in panic and gotten lost in the smoke and chaos. Some had been evacuated by neighbors or strangers trying to help. Some had been sent to outlying areas by parents who died before they could reunite with their children. Some had simply disappeared into the inferno, leaving no trace. Michiko never found her mother. She accepted, with the numb resignation of someone who has seen too much death, that her mother had died in the fire. But Yuki, there was no body, no confirmation, no certainty, which meant hope was possible. Terrible, torturous hope that her daughter might be alive somewhere. This scenario repeated across Japan in the war's final year. American bombing campaigns, while militarily effective, created humanitarian catastrophe. Families were scattered as cities evacuated. Children were sent to rural areas for safety, then lost contact when their home neighborhoods were destroyed. Parents died without being able to tell anyone where they'd sent their children. Record systems were destroyed in the fires, erasing documentation of who lived where, who was related to whom. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, hundreds of thousands of Japanese families existed in a state of agonizing uncertainty. They didn't know if their loved ones were alive or dead, where they might be, how to find them. The Japanese government, overwhelmed and effectively collapsed, had no resources to address this crisis. Local communities, themselves devastated, could barely care for immediate survivors, much less organize systematic searches for the missing. The result was chaos. Train stations became gathering points where desperate people searched for lost family members. Mothers stood on platforms holding photographs or drawings, hoping someone might have seen their children. Children wandered alone, trying to find their way back to homes that no longer existed. The elderly, displaced from destroyed neighborhoods, had no way to contact scattered family members.
Michiko Nakamura became one of thousands of women who spent their days searching. Every day, she went to Ueno Station, one of the main terminals in Tokyo, and stood on the platform showing her photograph. She went to survivor camps, to orphanages, to hospitals. She checked registries that various neighborhood associations tried to maintain, though these were fragmentary and incomplete. She had no money for food beyond the minimal rations the occupation authorities provided. She had no home beyond a corner in a crowded survivor shelter. She had nothing except that photograph and the desperate need to find her daughter. And she had no reason to expect help from Americans. She had been taught, through years of wartime propaganda, that Americans were demons, that they had firebombed Tokyo deliberately to kill civilians, that they took pleasure in Japanese suffering, that they were racially inferior savages who would show no mercy to defeated Japan. When the occupation began in September 1945, Michiko expected the worst. She expected brutality, exploitation, perhaps systematic rape, as Japanese military forces had committed in conquered territories. She expected Americans to treat Japanese civilians the way Japanese soldiers had treated Chinese civilians in Nanking, or Korean civilians in occupied Korea, or Filipino civilians in Manila. What she didn't expect was organization, efficiency, and something that seemed impossible, genuine concern for Japanese civilian welfare. The American occupation of Japan, which began officially on August 28, 1945, faced a humanitarian crisis that threatened to overshadow military victory. Japan's infrastructure was shattered, food production had collapsed, disease threatened to sweep through urban survivors, and hundreds of thousands of families existed in the limbo of not knowing whether loved ones were alive or dead. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood that military victory was meaningless if Japan descended into chaos, starvation, and epidemic disease. His mandate wasn't just to occupy Japan, but to rebuild it into a stable, democratic nation that would never again threaten its neighbors. This required not just economic reconstruction, but social reconstruction. And that meant addressing the crisis of displaced and separated families. In October 1945, MacArthur's headquarters established the Civil Information and Education Section, or CIE, with multiple mandates including democratization, education reform, and public health. But one of its most important functions, though less celebrated in histories, was coordinating efforts to reunite separated families.
The CIE worked with Japanese local governments, civilian organizations, and individual American soldiers to create family registry systems, compile lists of survivors, establish communication networks between cities, and physically transport displaced persons back to their home regions when possible. This was unprecedented. Occupying powers, historically, had not concerned themselves with reuniting enemy families. Occupations were about control, extraction of resources, and establishment of new political order. The humanitarian needs of defeated civilians were typically ignored or left to their own shattered governments to address. But American occupation of Japan operated on different principles, shaped by American idealism, by strategic calculation that stable societies were easier to govern than chaotic ones, and by the simple human compassion of individual Americans who couldn't ignore the suffering they witnessed. Lieutenant Robert Hartley, a 26-year-old officer from Ohio assigned to the CIE's Tokyo office, was one of thousands of Americans who found themselves inadvertently becoming social workers in occupied Japan. He had fought in the Pacific Theater, had lost friends to Japanese bullets and bombs, and had every reason to hate his former enemies. But what he found in Japan complicated his hatred. "I arrived expecting to see a defeated enemy," he wrote in a letter home in October 1945, discovered years later in his family's papers. "What I found were people, exhausted, traumatized, desperate people who had lost everything. Women searching for children, elderly people with nowhere to go, children alone wandering through ruins. I couldn't see them as enemies anymore. They were just humans who had suffered catastrophically." Lieutenant Hartley, whose Japanese language skills were minimal, but whose organizational skills were exceptional, helped establish the Family Registry Office at the converted school building in Tokyo's Shinjuku Ward. The office operated with a simple mission: collect information about missing persons, compile registries of known survivors, and create systems to match the missing with the found. The scale of the task was overwhelming. There were no computers, no databases, no automated systems. Everything was done by hand. Index cards, filing systems, messengers carrying information between offices, telephone calls when phone lines worked. American soldiers and Japanese civilians worked side by side,
processing thousands of cases, following leads, checking orphanages and hospitals and survivor camps. The operation required resources that military logistics provided: paper, filing cabinets, telephone access, transportation, personnel. But it also required something less tangible: the willingness to prioritize this work as important. And that willingness came from the top down.
MacArthur understood, whether from genuine humanitarian concern or cold strategic calculation, that helping Japanese families reunite served American interests. Reunited families were stable families. Stable families created stable communities. Stable communities could be governed more easily and would be more receptive to democratic reforms. But for the individual Americans doing the work, soldiers who answered phones, processed paperwork, transported displaced persons, searched through registries, the motivation was often simpler and more immediate. They were helping because people needed help, and they had the power to provide it. Private First Class Daniel Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco whose family had fled China to escape Japanese invasion, found himself working at the family registry office despite, or perhaps because of, his own complicated relationship with Japan. His family had suffered under Japanese occupation of Shanghai. His grandfather had been killed by Japanese soldiers in 1938. He had every personal reason to hate Japanese people. But working at the registry office, helping Japanese mothers search for their children, he discovered something that challenged his certainty. These mothers weren't abstractions, he later wrote in his memoir published in 1982. They weren't the Japanese who had committed atrocities in China. They were individual women who had lost their children and were desperate to find them. I couldn't hate them. I could only help them. And in helping them, I discovered something important about mercy, that it's most meaningful when extended to those you have reason to hate. The family registry office that Lieutenant Hartley and his team established became one of dozens across Japan. In every major city, American occupation authorities worked with Japanese civilians to create similar systems. They commandeered buildings, requisitioned supplies, assigned personnel. They created standardized forms for reporting missing persons and recording survivors. They established communication networks between cities, allowing information to flow across the fragmented nation. And crucially, they publicized these services. Through radio broadcasts, posted notices, and word of mouth, Japanese civilians learned that Americans were offering help finding lost family members. The message was simple. If you are searching for someone, report to the family registry office. If you have information about survivors, report it. The Americans will help you search. This message, this promise of help, contradicted every expectation shaped by wartime propaganda. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and nowhere was it more profound than for women like Michiko Nakamura, who had spent months searching fruitlessly for her daughter, who had exhausted every personal avenue, who had resigned herself to never knowing what happened to Yuki. October 17, 1945. Michiko Nakamura followed Lieutenant Hartley and his translator through the rain-slicked streets of Tokyo to the converted school building that housed the family registry office. She moved in a daze, not quite believing this was happening, waiting for the cruelty she expected to reveal itself. The building had been an elementary school before the war. Now it served as a processing center for the displaced and searching. The entrance hall, which had once seen children running and laughing, was filled with adults holding photographs, clutching pieces of paper with names written on them, all wearing the same expression of desperate hope, mixed with fear of disappointment. Lieutenant Hartley led Michiko to a desk where a Japanese woman, perhaps 50 years old, sat with stacks of index cards and ledgers spread before her. The woman, Mrs. Tanaka, had been a school teacher before the war. Now she worked for the Americans, helping to organize the chaos of information about missing persons. Through the translator, Lieutenant Hartley explained the process. "We need all the information you have about your daughter: her full name, age, last known location, physical description, any distinguishing features. We'll create a registry entry and cross-reference it with reports of found children. We also send inquiries to orphanages, hospitals, and survivor camps across the region." Michiko sat at the desk and poured out everything she knew. Yuki Nakamura, born April 15, 1938, 7 years old at the time of separation. Last seen in Asakusa neighborhood on March 9, 1945. Black hair, slight build, a small birthmark on her left shoulder. She had been wearing a blue school uniform. She would have been with her grandmother, Nakamura Sato, age 64, who was almost certainly dead. Mrs. Tanaka wrote everything down carefully, creating an index card with Yuki's information. Then she pulled out several ledgers, thick books filled with handwritten entries of children who had been found without families. She began searching through the entries, looking for any match. Michiko watched this process with emotions she couldn't name. A Japanese woman working for Americans. An American officer who had fought against Japan, now dedicating his time to helping Japanese families. Resources being devoted to finding one child among hundreds of thousands missing. It didn't align with anything she had been taught about how the world worked, how enemies behaved, how power operated. Mrs. Tanaka worked through 3 ledgers, checking dozens of entries. Each time she paused to read a description more carefully, Michiko's heart would seize. Was this it? Was this Yuki? But each time, some detail wouldn't match. Wrong age, wrong physical description, wrong location. After 30 minutes, Mrs. Tanaka looked up and said gently, "I don't see a match in the current registries, but we're receiving new reports every day. I'll flag your daughter's entry as priority. When new children are registered, we'll check against your information, and I'll send inquiries to all the orphanages and survivor camps in the region." She paused, then added, "Many children were evacuated to rural areas during the war. If your daughter was sent out of Tokyo, it will take longer to find her. But we have teams working in every prefecture. If she's alive, we'll find her." Michiko heard the words but struggled to process them. These people, these Americans and their Japanese collaborators, were going to search for Yuki. They were going to actively look, using resources and personnel, to find one child among hundreds of thousands. Why? What do they gain from this? Through the translator, Michiko asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you helping us? We were your enemies. My husband was a soldier who fought against you. Why do you care if Japanese families are reunited?" Lieutenant Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, through the translator, "The war is over. We won. But what does winning mean if Japan collapses into chaos? If children grow up as orphans? If families stay broken? If your society can't rebuild because the basic structures of family are destroyed? We're not helping you out of charity alone. We're helping because it serves our purposes too. A stable Japan is in America's interest." He paused, then added something more personal. "But also, I have a sister. She's 8 years old. If I lost her, if I didn't know where she was, I'd want someone to help me find her. So I help Japanese mothers search for their children because it's the human thing to do. Maybe that makes me soft by military standards, but I don't care. This work matters more than maintaining hatred." This was the answer Michiko received, pragmatic American self-interest combined with individual human compassion. Not noble idealism or heroic mercy, but a mixture of strategic calculation and decent human impulses. Somehow that made it more believable. Americans weren't saints. They were people doing what made sense given the circumstances and their values. Michiko left the registry office with an index card containing a reference number and instructions to return in 1 week. Mrs. Tanaka had promised that by then they would have completed inquiries to the major orphanages and might have more information. Walking back through the ruins of Tokyo, Michiko felt something she hadn't felt in 7 months. The possibility that she might see her daughter again. Not certainty. There were no guarantees, and she understood that Yuki might be dead, but possibility. And that small shift from zero hope to fractional hope was psychologically transformative.
That night, Michiko returned to the crowded survivor shelter where she had been living since March. She lay on her thin mat, surrounded by other women who had lost everything, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where Yuki was alive, where they could be reunited, where something resembling normal life might be possible again. The next week was agony. Michiko continued her daily routine of searching, going to Ueno Station, showing her photograph, checking with neighborhood associations. But now she carried the registry office's reference number, and several times each day she thought about going back early, before the week was up, just to see if any news had arrived. She resisted the urge. She didn't want to be a bother. She didn't want to abuse the Americans' willingness to help. This restraint, this Japanese cultural impulse not to impose, not to be troublesome, would become a pattern in interactions between Americans and Japanese civilians during the occupation. October 24, 1945, exactly 1 week after her first visit, Michiko returned to the family registry office at the converted school building. The rain had stopped, but the autumn sky remained gray, matching her mood of cautious anticipation mixed with fear of disappointment. Mrs. Tanaka saw her enter and immediately smiled. Not a polite smile, but a genuine smile of excitement. Michiko's heart began racing. That smile meant something good. Through an interpreter, Mrs. Tanaka said, "We found her. We found Yuki." Michiko Nakamura's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the desk for support, unable to speak, unable to process what she'd just heard. Mrs. Tanaka came around the desk and guided her to a chair, speaking rapidly in Japanese while another staff member brought water. "She's alive," Mrs. Tanaka repeated. "Your daughter is alive. She's in an orphanage in Nagano Prefecture. She was evacuated there in early March before the firebombing as part of a government program to send Tokyo children to rural areas for safety. When the war ended and communications broke down, she couldn't get back to Tokyo, and you couldn't find her because she wasn't in the city." Mrs. Tanaka showed Michiko a form, filled out by the orphanage staff. Yuki Nakamura, age 7, evacuated from Tokyo March 5, 1945. Physical description matching. Currently healthy, in good condition, attending the local school, waiting for family contact. The orphanage staff had noted, "Child is withdrawn, anxious about family, believes her mother and grandmother died in the firebombing, needs psychological support and family reunification as soon as possible." Michiko read the form through tears that made the words blur. Her daughter was alive. Not just alive, but healthy, attending school, being cared for. For 7 months, Michiko had searched, believing Yuki was probably dead, hoping against hope for a miracle. And the miracle had happened, delivered by Americans who had spent a week searching through registries and sending telegrams to orphanages across Japan.